My name is Mark Powell, and I used to be a ranger in Redwood National and State Parks. Those days seem like a dream now, shrouded in a hazy mist of horror and bewilderment. But back then, just over a year ago, it was all just beginning. I came to the Northern California coast seeking solitude and work in nature after the hustle of the big city and personal troubles I desperately wanted to leave behind. The Redwood Park seemed ideal. Miles of untouched forest, majestic coastal redwoods, pristine rivers, and a sense of ancientness hanging in the very air. The centuries-old trees stood so thick that sunlight barely pierced their canopy even on the clearest day, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the forest ceiling, often veiled in coastal fog. The ranger station consisted of a few sturdy wooden buildings right at the entrance to the main, most visited part of the park. My immediate supervisor was Raymond Brady, or just Chief Brady as everyone called him. He was a stocky man in his late 50s, with a weather-beaten face etched with wrinkles and calm but piercing gray eyes. He'd seen more in these woods than any of us and moved with the confidence of a man who knew every rock and tree on his territory. Brady wasn't a man of many words, but his rare comments were always to the point. He took me on without much fuss, gave me a brief orientation, issued my uniform and radio, and outlined my patrol sector. The first few weeks passed relatively calmly. I drove the trails, checked campsites, helped lost hikers, and soaked in the rugged beauty of the place. The forest lived its own life. The rustle of leaves, the crack of branches under the paws of unseen animals, the calls of birds. But sometimes, especially at night, sounds drifted from the depths that made my blood run cold. Old-timers from the nearby town of Klamath Point told stories about wolf packs officially unseen here for 50 years, about strange lights deep in the woods, about people vanishing without a trace in remote areas of the park. I wrote it off as local folklore, a way to pass the long, rainy evenings until the day I came face to face with a reality far more terrifying than any legend. It was late October, the season winding down, the tourists noticeably fewer. The nights grew long and cold, and thick fogs often rolled in, turning familiar trails into labyrinths of shadow. One evening, as I was finishing my shift and about to head home to my small cabin on the edge of the park, the radio on my belt crackled sharply with static. The dispatcher's voice was tense. A call had come in from one of the remote campsites near Bear Creek. People had heard horrific blood-curdling screams, unlike anything familiar. The callers were experienced hikers and swore it wasn't a bobcat or a cougar. Something big, they said. Something furious. Chief Brady was already on his feet, his face under the office lamplight looking like it was carved from stone. He nodded at me, silently pointing towards the door. It meant we were going together. I saw no fear in his eyes, more a kind of heavy, ingrained concern. As we loaded into the service pickup, a sturdy, well-worn Ford with powerful spotlights on the roof, I couldn't help but recall those tales about wolves. Not just wolves, but the ones that supposedly walk on two legs, as the old men whispered by the fireplace in the local bar. I'd scoffed inwardly back then, but now, under Brady's intense gaze and knowing we had to venture deep into the night forest, the thought didn't seem so ridiculous. The drive to Bear Creek took about an hour over a bumpy forest road, and then we still had to hike. Night had fallen on the park like a thick, inky blanket. In the headlights, the trees lining the road looked like bony hands reaching out from the darkness. The pickup's engine roared, tackling the inclines, its sound the only thing breaking the oppressive silence of the encroaching night. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and it wasn't just the autumn cold. Something about the very atmosphere of this night felt wrong, ominous. We left the pickup at the trailhead leading to Bear Creek. The air was cold and damp, smelling of decaying leaves, wet ferns, and raw earth. The moon hid behind thick clouds, and our powerful flashlights were the only source of light. Their beams snatched the trunks of giant redwoods and Douglas firs from the darkness, along with moss-covered rocks and tangled roots resembling snakes. Brady moved ahead, confident and almost silent for his build. I tried to keep up, carefully scanning the darkness on either side and listening to every rustle. At first, the forest seemed alive with its usual nocturnal activity. An owl hooted somewhere, fallen leaves crunched underfoot. The faint sound of the creek murmured in the distance. But as we went deeper into the woods, the sounds began to fade. First, the chirping of night insects disappeared. Then the birds fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in the treetops. Silence fell. Not just the absence of sound, but something thick, oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened and stopped carrying sound waves. My ears popped, like during a sudden pressure change. I stopped, trying to understand what was happening. My heart pounded faster. This was unnatural. The forest is never absolutely silent. Brady had frozen too, his figure tense. He slowly swept his flashlight beam around, his gaze wary. He clearly felt the same thing I did. We exchanged glances, but said nothing. In this crushing silence, any sound would have felt like sacrilege. We continued on, moving even slower and more cautiously now. The silence didn't retreat. It seemed to follow us, wrapping us in a thick cocoon. It felt like being under a glass dome or submerged underwater. I could feel the vibration of my own steps on the ground far more distinctly than usual, heard my own breathing and the blood pounding in my temples. Breathing became difficult, the air heavy, stagnant. Suddenly my flashlight beam snagged on something on the trunk of an old redwood. I moved closer. Deep scratches, claw marks. 3 parallel gouges had ripped through the thick, fibrous bark, reaching the lighter wood beneath. They were too high for a bear, starting around my chest level and extending upwards as far as the light reached. And too wide, too deep for a cougar. I shone the light around. Nearby, on the damp earth beneath the tree, were tracks. Huge prints resembling a wolf's, but easily twice the size of the largest wolf I'd ever heard of. They were pressed into the mud with such force it suggested the creature weighed hundreds of pounds. And the strangest thing, the tracks were uneven, as if the beast moved on 2 legs, leaning heavily on them. I went cold. The legends of wolves walking on their hind legs flashed back into my mind, but now they didn't seem like mere fairy tales. Brady came over, silently examining the tracks and scratches. His face showed no surprise, more a grim certainty. He shone his flashlight a little further, and the beam caught a tuft of dark, coarse fur snagged on a sharp branch of a bush. The fur was almost black, rough-looking. I couldn't identify what animal it belonged to. None of the park's known inhabitants had fur like that. A faint but unpleasant odor hung in the air, a mix of wet dog, damp earth, and something else metallic like blood. The oppressive silence became almost physically palpable. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible. I felt goosebumps rise on my arms, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. Instinct screamed at me to run, get away as fast as possible, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. We stood in the midst of the deathly silent forest, lit only by the trembling beams of our flashlights, and felt an unseen, heavy gaze upon us. It was at that exact moment the silence exploded, not with the usual sounds of the forest. From the darkness ahead, somewhere beyond a dense wall of trees, came a howl, or a scream. I still can't define exactly what it was. It started as a low, guttural growl, rising into a prolonged, soul-rending shriek that blended fury, pain, and something utterly inhuman. It resembled the cry of a wounded cougar, amplified 100 times, but with eerie overtones reminiscent of a distorted human voice. The sound hit my ears, making me instinctively duck. It echoed through the frozen forest, and it seemed the trees themselves shuddered from it. Then it cut off abruptly, leaving behind a ringing emptiness even more terrifying than the silence itself. My heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to burst. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my hand shaking. Brady stood motionless, but I saw his shoulders tense. He slowly raised a hand, signaling me to be quiet, though I was already frozen, afraid even to breathe. And then it appeared. From behind the massive trunk of an old redwood, about 30 yards away, a shadow stepped out. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and moved with an unnatural, jerky grace. The figure was coal black, merging with the shadows but distinctly visible against the lighter trunks behind it. The beams of our flashlights slid across it, but the light seemed to snag, absorbed by the blackness. Details were impossible to make out, just the general silhouette. Powerful shoulders, long limbs ending in something like claws, and a head set on a thick neck. It stood motionless, head tilted slightly as if listening or sniffing the air. And then I noticed the eyes. 2 points in the darkness that didn't just reflect our light. They glowed with their own dim, reddish fire like embers in a dying campfire. That gaze was fixed directly on us, and I felt an icy terror seize me from head to toe. In the same instant, I felt a strange vibration. It came from somewhere under the ground, low frequency, barely perceptible, but chilling me to the bone. It grew stronger, and with it came a strange, painful sensation in my jaw. My teeth began to ache, to vibrate, as if I'd touched a live wire. It became hard to breathe, my chest constricted by an invisible band. This wasn't just an encounter with a wild animal. It was a confrontation with something alien, possessing a power that affected the very matter around it. Panic washed over me. My only desire was to turn and run blindly, anywhere, just to get away from this nightmare. I'd already made a convulsive move backward when I felt a steel grip on my forearm. Brady. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was locked on the black figure. His lips barely moved, but I felt rather than heard his words, spoken almost soundlessly through clenched teeth. "Don't run, don't make noise, don't look back." His voice was firm, despite the obvious peril. There was something more than fear in his eyes, knowledge. He knew what this was, and he knew how to react. I forced myself to freeze, though every nerve screamed otherwise. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a few seconds. The black figure didn't move, its glowing eyes just boring into us from the darkness. The vibration and the ache in my jaw persisted. Finally, Brady slowly, very slowly, began to back away, pulling me with him. We retreated step by step, never taking our eyes off the creature, afraid to provoke it with any sudden movement. It didn't follow, but it didn't leave either, just stood there, watching. Only when we had put a decent distance between us and rounded a bend in the trail did Brady allow us to turn and walk faster, though still not running. We walked in silence, listening intently to the darkness behind us. Only after several long, agonizing minutes, when we were almost back to where we'd left the pickup, did the sounds begin to return to the forest. Tentatively at first, then more confidently, crickets started chirping, an owl hooted again somewhere. The wind rustled through the treetops. the normal life of the night forest resumed as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. The drive back to the station was completed in total silence. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the trees rushing past, but seeing only the tall, black silhouette and its eerie, glowing eyes. The feeling of vibration and the pain in my teeth were gone, but an icy fear had settled deep inside me. Brady drove focused, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His face was unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. When we finally returned to base, the lights of the station seemed like a saving beacon in an ocean of darkness. We got out of the truck in silence. The air here, near the park boundary, felt cleaner, lighter. Brady went into his office, and I followed. He poured himself strong coffee from a thermos on his desk and took a long gulp. Then he sighed heavily and looked at me with a long, searching gaze. His gray eyes seemed tired and filled with a kind of ancient sadness. He didn't ask what I'd seen or felt. He knew. Instead, he walked to the window beyond which lay the blackness of the night forest and spoke softly but clearly, so I would definitely hear. There are things in this park, Mark, that they don't write about in the guidebooks. Things ancient and not always friendly. The forest keeps its secrets, and not all of them are worth trying to unravel. He paused, then turned to me. What you saw tonight, that's just a small part. If you're not ready to accept this, if your soul rebels against this knowledge, leave. Find yourself a quieter place. No one will judge you. It wasn't an order or a threat. More like fatherly advice, a warning. He was giving me a choice. I stood there stunned by his words and by what I had experienced. Leave? The thought was tempting. Return to a normal life where the scariest things happen on the news, not 2 steps away from you in the night woods. But something held me back. Partly stubbornness, a refusal to back down from challenges, even ones like this. Partly professional duty, and also a dark, unhealthy spark of curiosity. What was it? Why was Brady so calm? What else did this forest hide? I couldn't sleep for a long time that night in my cabin. Brady's words echoed in my head. I remembered snippets of conversations in Klamath Point. The legends of the local Yurok and Tolowa tribes who lived here long before the white man came. They spoke of spirit shifters, of forest guardians taking animal forms, of creatures living on the edge of worlds. Stories about wolves that could walk on 2 legs were especially common, about people capable of transforming into huge beasts under the full moon. I recalled the tracks, the claws on the tree, the tuft of black fur, the hideous howl. It all fit. This couldn't just be an animal unknown to science. It was something else, something from ancient myths, terrifyingly real. I lay there, staring at the dark window, beyond which the ancient trees of redwood whispered. Now that sound seemed like a sinister murmur, full of untold stories and hidden threats. I decided to stay. But from that night on, I never looked at this forest the same way again. I understood that my job here wasn't just patrolling trails and helping tourists. It was also coexisting with the darkness that nested in the very heart of the redwood parks, and I strongly doubted I had the strength to endure this proximity. Several months passed since that night by Bear Creek. Winter enveloped the redwood parks in rain and fog, and although the main tourist flow had subsided, there was plenty of work for rangers. Clearing storm debris, monitoring wildlife, patrolling boundaries against poachers. I tried to bury the memory of the black silhouette and the oppressive silence under layers of daily chores. Tried to convince myself it was stress, my imagination playing tricks, a rare anomaly. But deep down, I knew the truth. Every time I went on patrol deep into the park, I felt on edge. I listened to every twig snap, peered into the shadows between trees, felt an unseen gaze on my back. My relationship with Brady took on a shade of silent understanding. We never discussed the incident again, but I saw in his eyes that he remembered and knew that I remembered too. Sometimes he gave me assignments closer to the station, as if protecting me from delving too deep into the wild corners of the park. Spring arrived, then summer. The forest came alive with lush greenery and birdsong. The park filled with tourists again. Life seemed to return to its usual rhythm, but the anxiety never completely left me. It lay dormant like a predator in ambush waiting for its moment. And that moment came in mid-July, on one of those hot, humid days when the thick fog reluctantly lifted from the ground even after noon, and the air was still and saturated with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. Another call came over the radio, a missing family, parents, and 2 teenage children. They had gone for a day hike on a marked but less popular trail in the western part of the park, and hadn't returned to their car at the parking lot by the expected time. The day was drawing to a close, and that was a bad sign. Darkness falls quickly in the woods, and nights, even in summer, can be cool and damp. Brady immediately organized a search operation. There were 5 of us rangers, including myself and the chief. We divided the presumed search area into sectors. I got a section adjacent to the main trail but leading off towards an old abandoned logging area where no work had been done for many years. The trail there was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and bushes. I was to go alone, maintaining radio contact with the rest of the team searching adjacent sectors. I started along my route, trying to move as quickly as possible while it was still light. The sun was already setting behind the treetops, painting the sky crimson through the haze of fog. The forest around was dense and gloomy. The ancient redwoods stood like a solid wall, their lower branches intertwining, creating nearly impassable thickets. The silence here was different, not the dead, oppressive emptiness I'd experienced at Bear Creek. This was the ordinary silence of a deep forest, broken only by the crunch of dry twigs under my boots, the occasional bird call, and my own breathing. But the memory of past horror made this silence tense, full of anticipation. I scanned the ground carefully for tracks, called out the names of the missing, but the only answer was the echo dying in the woods. I felt like a grain of sand in this vast, indifferent green ocean. The sense of loneliness was almost physical. The radio on my belt occasionally crackled with brief messages from colleagues, nothing yet. Dusk deepened, shadows lengthened, merging into solid darkness beneath the trees. I switched on my flashlight, its beam carving out a narrow sector of the path ahead. Walking became harder. I had to constantly watch my step to avoid tripping over roots or rocks. And it was then, just as I was starting to lose hope of finding any clues before complete darkness fell, that I noticed it. Through a dense curtain of branches and fog to the left of the trail, something dark, vertical, clearly man-made was visible. It was strange. No structures were marked on the maps here. Curiosity overcame fatigue and anxiety. I turned off the barely visible path and started pushing through the thick undergrowth, parting thorny blackberry branches and fern fronds wet with evening dew. After a few dozen yards, the woods suddenly opened up, and I found myself in a small clearing. The clearing was almost perfectly circular, and most strikingly, there was virtually no grass or shrubs on it. The ground was bare, packed down as if frequently walked upon, though I saw no signs of recent human presence. The contrast between this bare earth and the lush vegetation all around was stark and unnatural, as if some invisible force had scorched everything living within this circle. And in the middle of the clearing stood what I had seen through the trees. It was a wooden tower. Old, very old. The timbers, darkened by time and weather, were covered in moss and lichen, some rotted through. The structure looked rickety, leaning dangerously to one side, seemingly ready to collapse with a strong gust of wind. It looked like it might have once been a hunting blind or a logger's watchtower, but abandoned decades, if not centuries ago. Its upper platform, barely visible in the gathering dusk and swirling fog, was partially destroyed, the railings broken. And on this dilapidated platform, at the very top of the decrepit structure, someone was standing. The figure was motionless. In the dim twilight, I couldn't make out details, but it was definitely a person, or rather, a silhouette resembling a person. Short, slender. I thought it might be one of the missing children. My heart leaped, hope and fear mingling in my chest. I raised my flashlight, directing the beam upwards. The light snatched the figure of a girl from the gloom. She wore a simple, light-colored dress of an old-fashioned cut, perhaps from the early 20th century. Long, dark hair spilled over her shoulders. She stood with her back to me, gripping the remnants of the railing with thin hands and gazing somewhere up at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to show through the thinning fog. She was absolutely still, like a statue. I felt a prickle of unease. What was a child doing alone in such a remote place, atop a crumbling tower? How did she get up there? I carefully examined the base of the tower. No ladders, no steps, not even ropes. The lowest beams started at least 10 feet off the ground. Climbing up without special equipment was impossible. The girl on top seemed to float in the air, unreal. A strange silence permeated the area around the tower. Not the oppressive void of Bear Creek, but a kind of frozen, lifeless atmosphere. The air felt thick still. The sense of wrongness grew stronger. This place, this tower, this girl, all of it felt torn from normal reality. I stood at the edge of the strange, bare clearing, illuminating the rickety structure and the frozen figure upon it with my flashlight, and felt a chill run down my spine despite the summer evening. Something was terribly wrong. I took several deep breaths, trying to quell the rising panic. I had to act. Maybe the girl was in shock or injured. I decided to call out to her. "Hey, little girl, can you hear me? Do you need help?" My voice sounded hoarse and uncertain in the still air of the clearing. No reaction. The figure on the tower remained motionless, her gaze still fixed on the sky. I tried again, louder. Same result. It was as if she were deaf or existed in another dimension. I slowly approached the base of the tower, the flashlight beam playing over the old timbers, searching for any way to climb up. Futile. The structure was not only high but looked extremely unstable. Climbing those rotten beams would be suicide. I shone the light upwards again. Now I was close enough to make out some details. The girl's dress wasn't just light-colored, it was faded, as if it had hung out in the rain and sun for a long time. The skin on her hands clutching the railing looked unnaturally pale, almost translucent. And another strange detail. It seemed she wasn't standing on the platform boards, but hovering slightly above them, barely touching the surface. Unsure what else to do, I reached out and touched one of the lower support beams of the tower. It felt cold and damp, covered in slippery moss. A simple touch, an instinctive gesture, an attempt to make some kind of contact with this strange place. And at that very moment, the figure above moved. She didn't turn smoothly. Her head snapped around with an unnatural dry click that I clearly heard even from the ground, turning a full 180 degrees. The face, previously hidden, now looked directly down at me. And that face was a nightmare. I expected to see a frightened child, but what looked down at me was devoid of all expression save endless, frozen agony. The skin was deathly pale, stretched tight over the skull, lips thin, bloodless. But the most terrifying part, the eyes. Huge, completely black, without whites or pupils, they resembled two dark voids pulling you into an abyss. There was no fear, no curiosity in them, only emptiness and the cold of eternity. A sound escaped her unnaturally twisted mouth. It wasn't a scream or a cry. It was a quiet, drawn-out moan filled with such unbearable pain and sorrow that my chest ached. The sound was low, vibrating. It penetrated under the skin, causing nausea and dizziness. It felt as if the earth itself was moaning, the ancient wood of this cursed tower. The girl's face, in the beam of my flashlight, distorted for a moment, features blurring, transforming into something even more hideous, inhuman, resembling a death mask. I recoiled, dropping the flashlight. It hit the ground, flickered out for a second, and when it came back on, its beam danced across the clearing, snatching glimpses of a tree trunk, the bare earth, my trembling hands. I instinctively looked up at the tower. The figure was still there, her black eyes boring into me from the darkness. Terror paralyzed me. I couldn't move or scream. Then from behind the trees, from the direction I'd come, a voice called out, "Mark! Powell, you here? Answer me." It was one of my colleagues, Jimmy Carlson. Apparently, his search sector bordered mine. His voice, so ordinary, so human, sounded like salvation in this nightmare. I flinched, distracted for a second, turning my head towards the sound. "I'm here. By the old tower," I yelled back, my voice cracking. And then I immediately looked back up. The tower stood there, dark and ominous in the deepening dusk. But the platform at its top was empty. The girl had vanished, simply dissolved into thin air. There was no sound of steps, no rustle of branches, nothing. Just the old rotting tower in the middle of the bare clearing, and a silence that now seemed deafening after the fading moan. I stood there, breathing heavily, heart pounding like crazy. The flashlight trembled in my hand. A mirage? A hallucination? I knew it wasn't. It was real, and that was even more terrifying. Jimmy emerged from the bushes a minute later, breathing hard. "Find anything?" he asked, surveying the clearing and the tower. He shone his own light upwards. "What is this wreck? And what are you doing here? This is way off the trail." I struggled to catch my breath. I saw a girl here, up there, a little one, in an old dress." I stammered, trying to find words to describe what happened, realizing how insane it sounded. I pointed a trembling hand at the empty tower platform. She was just there. And then she disappeared. I expected disbelief, ridicule, maybe concern for my mental state. But Jimmy didn't laugh. He looked at the tower with a long, strange gaze, then shifted his eyes to me. There was no surprise on his face, rather weariness and a kind of grim resignation. He sighed heavily and said quietly, "Yeah, well, strange things happen in this park. Old-timers say there are places, bad places, where the past doesn't want to die." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Let's get out of here, Mark. Nothing for us here." His calm reaction scared me almost more than the apparition itself. It meant I wasn't crazy. It meant things like this weren't that rare here. And other rangers had encountered them too. They just didn't advertise it. We returned to the main trail. Barely half an hour later, word came over the radio that the missing family had been found. They were located a few hundred yards from where I'd seen the tower, safe and sound, but badly frightened and disoriented. They were huddled under a large tree, unable to clearly explain how they got there. They said they were just walking along the trail, then suddenly felt strangely tired, as if they'd fallen into a waking dream and woke up in the dark, in an unfamiliar place. They hadn't seen any girl or tower. Their story only added more questions to the already eerie picture. Later, back at the station, once the commotion with the found family had died down, I sat in my office trying to process what had happened. Now I had two pieces of the puzzle, two inexplicable, nightmarish events. First, the nocturnal encounter with the huge black creature that brought with it dead silence and a physical sense of hostile power. A creature chillingly reminiscent of the werewolves from local legends. Second, the abandoned tower in the strange clearing and the ghostly figure of a girl from the past. Her inhuman gaze and moan, her sudden disappearance. This felt like a classic haunting, an echo of some long-ago tragedy tied to this place. Were these two incidents connected? I didn't know for sure. But both occurred here in the Redwood Parks. Both were steeped in an atmosphere of ancient, otherworldly horror. I remembered Brady's words about the forest keeping its secrets. Now I understood them more deeply. This park wasn't just a wildlife sanctuary. It was a repository for something else. Dark forces, restless spirits, creatures spawned by centuries of darkness under the canopy of giant trees. The legends of werewolves, forest spirits, cursed places. They weren't just folklore. They were echoes of truth, distorted by time and fear. As I was leaving the station that evening, I ran into Brady at the exit. He said nothing, just gave me his piercing look, which held both sympathy and that same silent warning. He seemed to be asking me again without words. "Are you still sure you want to stay here? Are you ready to live alongside this?" I didn't answer. I didn't know the answer myself. The fear hadn't gone away. It had become my constant companion in these woods. But alongside it grew a perverse sense of duty, mixed with dangerous curiosity. I stayed. I continued working as a ranger in Redwood National and State Parks for some time after that. But the mystery of the abandoned tower and the call of the night forest changed me forever. I left the park many years ago, but a part of me remained there. In that bare clearing under the shade of the ancient trees, listening to the ghosts moan and the growl of the darkness. Story 2. My name is Jake Sanders, 27 years old, and most of my life has been spent far from cities, in a land where skyscrapers don't block the horizon, and the air smells of pine needles and damp earth. My father was a hunter, a stern but fair man who taught me to read tracks, understand the forest, and respect its unwritten laws. He used to say nature isn't an amusement park, but a living organism that can be both generous and deadly dangerous. Those lessons are ingrained in me as deeply as the smell of gunpowder and resin. Now, I'm part of that wild system myself, a ranger in Sequoia National Park. This place is lost somewhere in the depths of the Sierra Nevada, in the California mountains, vast, wild, and as I soon learned, unforgiving. The giant sequoias that gave the park its name soared towards the sky like gnarled columns, their crowns intertwining so densely that even at noon, twilight reigned beneath them. The rivers here were turbulent, the trails treacherous, and the weather changed with frightening speed. My new home was the North Peak Lookout Tower, a plankboard structure, one of several scattered across the immense park territory like forgotten sentinels. Creaky, smelling of wood and solitude, It stood on a high hill, offering views of miles upon miles of untouched wilderness. Climbing the shaky steps always echoed hollowly in my chest. Inside, Spartan conditions: a cot, a table, a radio, worn maps on the walls, and a potbelly stove, my only source of heat on cold nights. The silence here was almost tangible, broken only by the howl of the wind, the crack of branches under the paws of unknown beasts, and the rare crackling radio comms with the central post or other rangers. The nearest colleague, Trevor, was stationed at the South Slope Tower, but he was more than a day's hike away over rough terrain. We were islands of civilization in an ocean of primordial chaos. The job only seemed simple at first glance. Monitor fire danger, map fallen trees, occasionally help lost hikers. A routine familiar since childhood, patrolling territory, checking equipment, keeping observation logs. I settled in quickly, feeling at home among these silent giants. But there was another side to this job, the one not mentioned aloud during briefings. It lurked in the omissions of senior rangers in their tired eyes, in the strange rules forbidding leaving the tower after sunset without a compelling reason. The shift supervisor, Brenda McKinney, a woman with a hard gaze and a weather-beaten face, once dropped a phrase that stuck in my head. She said our main task wasn't just maintaining order and protecting nature from people, but also, and I quote her almost verbatim, ensuring that certain things dwelling in the remotest corners of the park didn't get out. At the time, I dismissed it as local folklore, a way to scare the new guy. I didn't yet know how literally I should have taken her words. The danger in Sequoia National Park wasn't just steep slopes and wild animals. Something else lurked here, ancient and hungry. And my tower wasn't just an observation post. It was a post on the border of the known world. With the arrival of summer, the park came alive. The silence was replaced by the roar of engines, shouts, and laughter. Trails recently deserted filled with people in bright clothes, carrying backpacks and cameras. Tourist season had begun, and with it an annual festival somewhere nearby, its noisy echoes reaching even my remote tower. Work increased. Lost city folk, illegal campfires, trash left in clearings. The usual ranger headaches, but in Sequoia National Park, even this felt different. It seemed the very presence of so many people disrupted the fragile balance of these places, awakening something dormant in the shadows of the giant trees. Trevor at South Slope was temporarily replaced by another ranger, Frank Rose. His voice over the radio sounded more strained than Trevor's. Frank was older, more experienced, and less prone to jokes. One evening, he contacted me off schedule. His voice was low, almost breaking. He reported a find in a remote sector of his zone. Not just bear or cougar tracks. The mutilated remains of a deer, torn apart with such force and brutality that it didn't fit the pattern of normal predation. Bones were broken unnaturally, flesh ripped to shreds, as if by something possessed by blind rage. Frank couldn't determine who or what had left those tracks. He only advised me to be careful, especially at night. The park operated under a strict set of rules, which had to be reiterated especially often at the start of the season. Going off marked trails was forbidden, especially alone and at dusk. Hunting was prohibited. The park's fauna was protected. Building fires anywhere was strictly forbidden, especially leaving them unattended or keeping them going late into the night. These rules had always seemed overly strict to me, but after talking with Frank and hearing Brenda's phrase, they took on a new, ominous meaning. Perhaps they were designed not only to protect nature from people, but also people from something in this nature. Despite the prohibitions, rumors crept through the park, passed in whispers from one group of tourists to another, fragments reaching me via radio chatter or chance encounters. Talk of poachers operating in protected zones, but not ordinary hunters. Strange, secretive individuals whom no one had clearly seen. At night, unnerving sounds came from deep within the forest, not the howl of a wolf or the roar of a bear, but something in between, drawn out and blood-curdling. Some tourists, venturing too far, claim to have seen a huge, dark figure in the pre-dawn mist, resembling a giant wolf, but occasionally moving on two legs. "Skinwalker," whispered the most impressionable. I tried to brush these stories off, blaming overactive imaginations and the alcohol many use to warm themselves on vacation. But the anxiety grew. The air seemed to thicken, filled with a sense of impending doom. The chaos brought by humans seemed to awaken an ancient evil that had only been slumbering in the darkest corners of Sequoia National Park. Night fell on Sequoia National Park like a thick, inky blanket. The wind died down, and the silence became so profound I could hear the potbelly stove crackling as it cooled in the corner of my tower. I stood on the observation deck, leaning on the railing. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Below stretched a sea of dark crowns, lit only by the pale crescent moon peeking through the clouds. I peered into the darkness, trying to make out the familiar shapes of hills and valleys. Suddenly the silence was shattered by a sound. Or rather, two quick dry cracks like gunshots. They came from the southeast, from an area where, according to my markers, no one should have been. I instinctively narrowed my eyes, trying to see something in that direction. And then I saw two short, bright flashes of light pierce the curtain of trees. Hunters? Poachers? Either way, it was a flagrant violation of the rules. I was already reaching for the radio to report the incident when suddenly, from the same spot where the shots had come, a scream erupted. But it wasn't a human scream of terror or pain. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. A high, drawn-out, distorted howl, transitioning into a gurgling snarl filled with such primal fury and suffering that my blood ran cold. It rolled through the forest, echoed off the mountainsides, and died away, leaving behind a ringing dead silence. That sound belonged to no animal I knew. It was wrong, alien. My heart hammered somewhere in my throat. Forgetting the radio, I grabbed my powerful flashlight and trusty rifle, an old Winchester inherited from my father. I had to check. I had to know what happened there. The descent from the tower felt like an eternity. My legs tangled on the steps, hands trembling. Bursting into the forest, I ran towards the sound, navigating by memory and compass. The flashlight beam snatched tree trunks from the darkness, gnarled roots like crooked fingers and shadows that danced at the edge of my vision, making me jump at every rustle. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of ozone and something else. Something metallic, sweetish, blood. I ran, leaping over fallen logs, pushing through bushes until I smelled smoke. Ahead, in a small clearing, a light flickered. A campfire. I slowed my pace, trying to move as quietly as possible. The scene that unfolded before me was a nightmare. A small tourist campsite was destroyed, the tent ripped to shreds, belongings scattered as if a hurricane had swept through. The campfire still smoldered, casting an uneven light on the scene of destruction. And amidst this chaos, on the ground, a few steps from the dying embers, lay a body. A young guy, judging by his clothes, one of the tourists. He lay face down in a huge, rapidly darkening pool of blood. His back and side were reduced to a bloody mess. The wounds were horrific, deep, ragged, as if he'd been torn by massive claws. His insides were partially spilled out, scattered across the grass with monstrous carelessness. This wasn't the work of a bear or cougar. No predator kills so senselessly and brutally. This was pure primal extermination. I stood paralyzed by horror, gripping the rifle so tightly my knuckles turned white. The echo of that inhuman scream still hung in the air. Now I knew what it meant. And I understood that Brenda's phrase wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. Something lived in the forests of Sequoia National Park, and it had begun to hunt. Icy horror gripped me beside the mangled body, but the instincts hammered into me by my father and years of living in the wild took over. Someone had fired shots. The guy wasn't alone. I snapped my head up, listening. From behind the trees on the other side of the clearing came muffled sounds of a struggle. Branches cracking, heavy breathing, choked cries. My flashlight beam shot in that direction, pulling two more figures from the gloom. A man and a woman, pressed back against a giant sequoia, desperately fending off something dark, massive, moving before them with sticks. I stepped forward, the flashlight beam locking onto the attacker. And what I saw made me freeze, forgetting to breathe. It was a creature from nightmares. Huge, far larger than the biggest grizzly, it stood slightly hunched on powerful hind legs, though its front limbs, disproportionately long and armed with terrifying claws, also touched the ground. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur of a dirty gray mottled color, through which lumpy, dark skin showed. The head was elongated, with a massive jaw full of long, sharp teeth like needles. Its eyes glowed with a dull, yellowish light reflecting my flashlight beam. Bloody shreds of flesh and fur, likely remnants of the unfortunate guy by the fire, hung from the creature's mouth. It emitted a low, gurgling snarl that vibrated the air. Its movements were sharp, jerky, yet incredibly fast and strong. It was toying with its victims, batting away their sticks with casual swipes of its paw. I raised the rifle, trying to get the thing in my sights, but my hands were shaking. Before I could fire or even yell to distract the monster, another one leaped out of the darkness to the right of the first. It was slightly smaller, but no less hideous and ferocious. Its appearance sealed the fate of the couple by the tree. While the first creature was momentarily distracted by the new threat, me, standing there with a flashlight and a weapon, the second lunged at the man with lightning speed. There was a short, gurgling cry and the crunch of breaking bones. The woman screamed, but her cry was instantly cut off as the first beast, turning, brought its clawed paw down on her. I stood rooted to the spot, watching this scene of unspeakable brutality. Blood ran cold in my veins, muscles refusing to obey. I knew that if I revealed myself now, if I fired, I would simply be the next victim. There were two of them. They were incredibly fast and strong. My rifle felt like a child's toy against such monsters. It all happened in seconds. The screams stopped, replaced by the hideous sounds of tearing flesh and chewing. The two creatures bent over their victims, engrossed in their bloody feast. They moved with a kind of gruesome mechanical purposefulness, paying me no attention, as if I were not a threat but merely an insignificant detail of the landscape. Helplessness and shame burned inside me. I was a ranger. I was supposed to protect people. But faced with this primal horror, I was paralyzed by fear. I had come face to face with what hid in the shadows of Sequoia National Park, and I realized that human laws and weapons were powerless here. This was their territory, and we were just victims trespassing on it. I don't remember how I got back to the tower. My legs carried me automatically while my mind desperately tried to process what I'd seen. Images of the mangled bodies, the hideous creatures, their yellow eyes and gurgling snarls haunted me, flashing before my eyes with every crack of a twig, every howl of the wind. I bolted the door, though I knew how absurd the measure was against such beings. The rifle lay beside me on the cot, cold and heavy. I spent the night sleepless, sitting on the floor, back against the wall, listening to every noise outside. The silence of the forest no longer felt peaceful. Now it was filled with hidden menace, anticipation. Every sound echoed in my ears, amplified by fear. I felt completely broken, empty. The horror I had witnessed had seeped deep under my skin, leaving an icy trace. At dawn, as the first rays of sun painted the sky pale pink, I gathered my strength and got on the radio. My voice trembled, words stumbled. I reported the incident to the shift supervisor, Brenda McKinney. Told her about the shots, the scream, the destroyed camp, the 3 bodies. I deliberately omitted details about the attacker's appearance, calling them only unknown large predators. Something told me the full truth would be dismissed as madness or shock. Brenda's response over the radio was strange. There was no surprise or panic in her voice, which I had expected. Only a business-like, almost indifferent tone. She said a team had already been dispatched to the scene, that they would handle the formalities, clean up the site, notify the families, and address the issue. Her calmness was more frightening than the nightmares. As if such incidents were routine for her, an annoying but familiar part of the job. She ordered me to stay at the tower and take no independent action until further instructions. The connection broke, leaving me with a heavy feeling of distrust and even greater anxiety. During the day, the radio waves came alive. Rangers from other sectors talked among themselves, discussing the incident. The official story handed down from above spoke of an attack by an unusually aggressive pack of wolves or bears. But doubt seeped through in fragmented phrases in their tones. Someone mentioned similar incidents from previous years in remote park areas, incidents that were kept quiet. Rumors resurfaced about strange sounds, giant tracks belonging to no known animal. And again, now with poorly concealed fear, they spoke of the legends, of forest spirits, of cursed lands upon which the park was founded, and of him, the skinwalker. The figure from old Native American tales and lumberjack horror stories rumored to inhabit these woods for decades, existing outside of time and the laws of nature. Before I would have laughed, but after what I'd seen last night, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. It seemed the park management knew far more than they let on, desperately trying to hide a terrible truth behind a mask of accidents and wild animal attacks. The truth that something monstrous truly dwelled in Sequoia National Park. Once every 2 weeks, all rangers whose towers were within reasonable distance gathered at the central camp at the foot of the mountains. To discuss current affairs, restock supplies, exchange news. Usually it was a routine event, a chance to see human faces after long solitude. But this time, the atmosphere was different, tense, oppressive. The recent events hung heavy in the air. We sat in the large log administration building, smelling of coffee and wood shavings. Conversations were quiet, glances anxious. Frank Rose, my neighbor from South Slope, was the first to break the silence. He looked older in the past few days, dark circles under his eyes. In a quiet but firm voice, he recounted what he'd seen a few days earlier, shortly before the tragedy with the tourists. While patrolling a high ridge trail, he noticed movement in the crowns of the giant sequoias. It wasn't a bird or a squirrel. Something large, dark, moving through the branches with incredible agility, leaping from tree to tree at a great height. He couldn't get a clear look, but the very idea of such a creature, capable of climbing trees like a monkey, sent shivers down his spine. Then, an old ranger named Hank, who worked in the most remote western sector, spoke up. He said that during a night patrol he'd found tracks and then saw the beast itself. A huge wolf, but standing on two legs like a man. It just watched Hank from the darkness, then silently vanished into the thicket. Its eyes, Hank said, burned with yellow fire. A heavy silence followed these accounts. All eyes turned to Brenda McKinney, seated at the head of the table. She surveyed us with a long, careful look, and her face showed no trace of the indifference I'd heard over the radio. She sighed, as if making a difficult decision. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was steady, but laced with weariness and resignation. She confirmed our worst fears. There was indeed something in the park, or somethings. Creatures defying classification, extremely dangerous, possibly of supernatural origin. She didn't elaborate on their nature, only saying that park management had known about the problem for years. There was some unofficial operation for containment or cleanup, but judging by recent events, it was clearly failing. Perhaps the creatures had multiplied or become more aggressive. The conversation was brief, businesslike. No theories, no legends, just dry facts and new instructions. Park security was being increased. Night patrols were doubled, now only in pairs and with heavy weaponry. Any unauthorized wandering, especially at night, would be severely punished, up to termination. Certain park zones were declared temporarily closed to visitors under the pretext of bear activity. We were ordered to report any suspicious incidents immediately, but to avoid direct confrontation unless absolutely necessary. It became clear that management acknowledged the threat but was still trying to keep everything secret from the outside world. The veil of secrecy had lifted only slightly, revealing a gaping abyss full of monsters. And among those monsters, according to Hank's story, might indeed be the one legends called the skinwalker or werewolf. Returning to my tower after the meeting, I felt even more dejected. Knowing the truth brought no relief, only amplifying the sense of danger and isolation. Hank's words about the huge wolf on two legs wouldn't leave my mind. It matched the rumors, the vague mentions in old reports I'd glimpsed in the Central Camp archive. Something pulled me back there. During my next supply run, I found an excuse to linger and slipped into the old storage shed attached to the administration building. A dusty place, cluttered with decommissioned equipment and stacks of yellowed papers. It was there, in a far corner, that I stumbled upon a box of archival materials marked "Unclassified Incidents, Strictly Confidential." I spent several hours there, sifting through brittle folders, reports of missing hikers and even entire families, their disappearances blamed on accidents or animal attacks, but with notes mentioning atypical tracks or extreme brutality, records of strange findings made by rangers decades ago, and most interestingly, several faded maps and documents from an even earlier period before the park was established. They marked small logging settlements and Native American villages that no longer existed. Accompanying notes spoke of their sudden disappearance, of rumors about a wolf spirit or wolf man that came down from the mountains under the full moon and took people. Legends that were now taking on a terrifying reality. A few nights later, I confirmed their truth myself. I was making rounds in my sector, moving along a ridge under the light of an almost full moon. The forest was bathed in an eerie silver glow, shadows seeming thick and alive. I stopped at the edge of a small clearing, scanning the area, and then I saw him. On the opposite side, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure, tall, stooped, covered in dark fur. It stood on two legs, but its proportions were wrong, bestial. Long arms with claws nearly touched the ground. The head was wolf-like, with an elongated snout and pointed ears. Two yellow eyes, like embers, burned in the darkness, staring directly at me. This wasn't one of the mottled monsters that had torn apart the tourists. This one was different. Its posture, its gaze, held not blind fury but cold, calculating intelligence. It didn't attack. It just watched me. In that moment, fragments of childhood memories surfaced. My father, sitting by the fire after a long hunt, telling me not just about animal behavior, but also old stories he'd heard from local Native Americans and old-timers. Stories of great wolves, shadow walkers, smarter and craftier than ordinary beasts, and of evil things that hunt humans under the moonlight, taking the form of a half-man, half-wolf. Back then, I listened like they were fairy tales. Now, I stood face to face with a creature from those tales. The realization hit with renewed force. The existence of such a creature, like a werewolf, intelligent, cunning, capable of observation and possibly planning, changed everything. It wasn't just a mindless predator like those things in the clearing. It was something more. Perhaps it was behind the increased aggression of the other monsters. Perhaps it controlled this pack or, at the very least, coordinated their attacks. The threat wasn't just physical anymore, it became personal. It had seen me. It knew I was here and it was watching. The knowledge that an intelligent and deadly predator was watching me was unbearable. Just sitting in the tower waiting for the next attack felt impossible. I had to act, try to at least scare the creatures away from my sector, maybe pick up their trail, understand their movements. I decided to set an ambush. Not to kill. I wasn't sure I could handle even one of them, let alone the werewolf. But to fight back. To show that this territory wasn't defenseless. I chose a narrow pass between rocks, which, judging by the tracks, animals frequently used, including those whose prints resembled neither wolf nor bear. I spent a whole day preparing, set up several tripwire flares, chose a good firing position on a rock ledge with a clear view, and an escape route. As bait, I left a piece of meat from my supplies. The night was moonlit again, the forest silent and tense. I lay prone on the ledge, rifle ready, senses on high alert. The hours of waiting dragged on agonizingly. Finally, I heard it. The familiar crack of branches, heavy breathing. The first creature emerged from around the bend in the trail, the same mottled, grotesque figure as the ones I'd seen in the clearing. It greedily sniffed the air, catching the scent of the bait. A second followed, then a third. They moved cautiously, looking around, but hunger apparently overcame their instincts. They approached the meat, snarling and shoving each other. I aimed at the largest one, but hesitated, waiting for the main player. And he appeared. The werewolf stepped out from the shadows of the trees, silent as a ghost. He was taller and leaner than the other creatures, his movements fluid, confident. He stopped a few yards from the pack, his yellow eyes carefully scanning the surroundings. He clearly sensed something was wrong. At that moment, one of the creatures tripped a wire. A soft pop echoed as a flare ignited, bathing the pass in a flash of red light. The creatures roared in surprise. The werewolf instantly spun towards me, its gaze locking onto mine. The time for thinking was over. I fired. The bullet hit the werewolf in the left shoulder, making it roar in pain and fury. It staggered but didn't fall. The other creatures, enraged by the shot and the wounding of their leader, or whatever he was to them, charged towards my ledge with incredible speed. Chaos erupted. I fired almost without aiming, trying to hold them back. One creature collapsed, hit by a shot to the head, but another was already scrambling up the rock face. I knocked it back with the rifle butt, but just then, the third creature managed to leap onto the ledge from the side. Before I could turn, it slashed me across the arm and side with its claws. Sharp pain shot through my body. I stumbled back, nearly falling off. The rifle slipped from my weakened grasp. The creature tensed to pounce, its jaws wide open. Salvation came unexpectedly. The werewolf, clutching its wounded shoulder, let out a short, commanding snarl. The creature on the ledge froze, then reluctantly leaped down, rejoining the others. The werewolf looked at me one more time, and in that instant, before it vanished into the dark forest with its pack, I thought I saw something flicker across its distorted wolfish face. Something almost human. Not fury, maybe. Fear? Or recognition? I was left alone on the ledge, wounded, bleeding, clutching a useless rifle. I had survived. But I knew one thing. This wasn't just a hunt. This was the beginning of a war, and it was far from over. The journey back to the tower was torture. Every step sent waves of throbbing pain through my arm and side. Blood soaked my clothes, leaving a dark trail on the forest floor. My head swam from pain and blood loss, but adrenaline and fear pushed me forward. I reached the tower at dawn, exhausted, barely able to stand. Locking the door, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. First aid first. The creature's claws had left deep, ragged, inflamed gashes. I cleaned them with antiseptic, bandaged them tightly with strips of clean cloth. The pain was agonizing, but it was sobering. The shock receded, leaving behind a dull, aching pain and the cold realization of a new reality. There was no more room for doubt, denial, or attempts at rational explanation. The monsters were real. The werewolf was real. The legends were true. Sequoia National Park wasn't just a beautiful but dangerous piece of wilderness. It was a cage, a boundary holding back an ancient evil that now seemed to be breaking free. And I was on the front lines of this invisible war. There was no turning back. Thoughts of quitting, leaving, forgetting this nightmare flickered but were immediately dismissed. I couldn't just walk away knowing what was happening here. Knowing the danger threatening unsuspecting tourists, other rangers. My father taught me not to run from danger, but to face it head on. And though this danger surpassed anything I'd ever encountered, the sense of duty and stubbornness inherited from him wouldn't let me give up. I would stay. I would defend this patch of land, this post, whatever the cost. I contacted Brenda, briefly reporting the encounter, the injury, omitting the specific details and who exactly I had wounded. Her reaction was surprisingly swift. She informed me that transport with a medic and backup was already en route. A few hours later, the thrum of a helicopter echoed over the forest. It landed in a small clearing at the base of the hill. Several people in nondescript tactical gear, without identifying marks, disembarked. They moved with coordinated professionalism, their faces unreadable. With them was a medic, who quickly treated my wounds, and Brenda herself. She curtly informed me that a team of specialists, hired by park management to resolve the problem in this sector, had arrived. They were to clear the area where the confrontation occurred and try to track the creatures. While the medic worked on me, I watched these people. They deployed equipment, checked weapons, serious hardware, clearly not standard park service issue. Cold determination showed in their eyes. They knew what they were up against. They were part of that containment Brenda had mentioned. Part of the system hiding the truth from the world. I watched them disappear into the forest, ready to kill something most people wouldn't even believe existed. A complex feeling washed over me. On one hand, relief that I wasn't alone. On the other, doubt. Was it right to hide such a threat? Wouldn't this deception lead to even greater casualties in the future? The helicopter departed, taking Brenda and leaving me alone with my thoughts and pain. I looked out at the darkening forest, where another secret battle was now unfolding. I knew the encounter with the werewolf was just the first act. The story of Sequoia National Park, my story, was just beginning. And its ending was hidden in the darkness, as deep and thick as the shadows beneath the ancient sequoias.